Somewhere off the coast, right now, a trawler is hauling up a net, heavy enough to strain its winches. The crew sorts through the catch as fast as they can, shrimp into one bin, cod into another, and then, without much ceremony, they shovel a good portion of it back over the side. Not spoiled fish, not undersized fish, necessarily. Sometimes it's the exact same species people are paying good money for, at a restaurant 300 miles away, dead, floating, gone. This happens on fishing boats all over the planet, every single day, and most people who eat seafood have never once thought about it. The common assumption is that this waste must be accidental, some unfortunate byproduct of imprecise fishing gear that the industry would obviously fix if it could. That assumption is wrong, or at least incomplete. A significant share of what gets thrown overboard isn't waste in the sense of a mistake. It's waste by design, a direct and predictable output of the rules governments wrote to prevent something worse, the total collapse of fish populations. Understanding why requires looking at how modern fishing actually works, not how it's popularly imagined. Picture a trawl net the size of a football field being dragged along the seafloor or through open water. It doesn't select for one species the way a fishing rod does. It captures everything roughly its size that happens to be in its path. The target fish, yes, but also other species, juveniles to small to be legally sold, and sometimes turtles, sharks, or seabirds that got caught up in the sweep. Fisheries scientists call this non-target catch, bycatch, and a global study published in 2020 estimated that around 9.1 million tons of fish are discarded back into the ocean every year, representing roughly a tenth of everything hauled up worldwide. Some fishing methods are far worse than others. Trawling for shrimp, in particular, has one of the highest ratios of unwanted catch to target catch of any fishing method on Earth, in some cases discarding several pounds of other marine life for every pound of shrimp kept. The easiest way to understand why a boat would throw back perfectly edible fish is to imagine a grocery store with a strange rule. You're only allowed to buy exactly 12 apples this month. No more, no fewer. And if your cart already has 13 items, and one of them is an apple, you have to leave an apple behind at the register, even if it means also leaving behind a bag of oranges sitting right next to it that you already paid for. That's roughly how a fishing quota works. Regulators set a total allowable catch for a particular species, calculated from population surveys, meant to keep that species from being fished into collapse. A boat that has already caught its full quota of, say, cod, is legally required to throw back any additional cod it catches, even if that cod is already dead, even if it will never survive being tossed back into the water. The species itself isn't the problem. The paperwork is. This is where it stops looking like carelessness and starts looking like brutal, deliberate cost-benefit math. A fishing vessel is a business balancing several conflicting pressures at once: the price of fuel, the wages of a crew, the market value of what's in the hold, and a legal ceiling on how much of any one species it's permitted to bring to port. If a boat has room in its hold and can choose between a lower value fish it's already at quota for and a higher value fish it still has room to catch, the economically rational move, sometimes the only legal move, is to discard the lower value catch to make space. A practice fisheries economists call high grading. It isn't a boat captain acting maliciously, it's a boat captain acting exactly as the incentive structure tells him to. Landing an over-quota fish can mean fines, confiscation of gear, or the loss of a fishing license entirely. So the cheapest and safest option, from a purely financial standpoint, is often to make the evidence disappear at sea, rather than bring it to a dock where an inspector might be waiting. It's worth pausing on how strange this is when compared to almost every other industry built around a natural resource. A logging company doesn't get penalized for accidentally cutting a tree it wasn't licensed to cut. It just isn't allowed to sell the wood, but it can usually still make some use of it. A fishing boat, by contrast, is often better off throwing a resource away entirely than admitting it exists. The system was built with good intentions. Quotas exist because unmanaged fishing genuinely does drive species toward collapse, and the alternative to strict limits has historically been far worse for ocean ecosystems. But the mechanism chosen to prevent overfishing accidentally created a second problem. It rewards concealment over honesty, and in doing so, guarantees a certain amount of dead fish will always end up back in the water instead of on a plate. Fishing has not always worked this way. For most of human history, catching fish was constrained mainly by physical limits: how far a boat could sail, how much a crew could haul by hand, how long fish could stay fresh before returning to shore. Waste existed, but it wasn't systemic in the same way. A fisherman in a small coastal village kept almost everything he caught, because catching too much in the first place was rarely the problem. Catching enough was. The shift began with industrialization, engine-powered vessels, refrigeration, sonar for locating schools of fish, and nets that could be dragged for miles at a time. Suddenly, it was possible for a relatively small number of vessels to extract fish faster than populations could naturally replace themselves. And by the mid-20th century, several major fisheries had already crashed under the weight of that new efficiency. The quota systems and bycatch rules that exist today were a direct response to those collapses. Regulators trying to retrofit limits onto an industry whose technology had outpaced its sustainability. In other words, discarding isn't some separate flaw bolted onto an otherwise clean system. It's the visible scar tissue from an earlier era of industrial overreach, a compromise solution to a problem that industrial fishing itself created. Some places have tried to close the loophole. The European Union, for example, phased in a policy sometimes called the landing obligation, which required boats to bring most bycatch to shore, instead of discarding it at sea, counting it against quotas either way. The logic was straightforward. If throwing fish overboard doesn't actually make the paperwork problem disappear, boats have less incentive to do it, and more incentive to use gear that avoids catching the wrong species in the first place. Selective fishing gear has genuinely improved for this reason. Turtle excluder devices, escape panels for juvenile fish, and better sonar targeting have all measurably reduced unwanted catch in specific fisheries. Over the past few decades, global discard rates today are meaningfully lower than they were in the late 1980s. But enforcement at sea is difficult. Observers can't be on every boat, and the underlying economic pressure, more value in the hold, less risk of penalty, hasn't disappeared. It's just being managed rather than solved. There's something worth sitting with in all of this. Beyond the specific policy details of fisheries management, nearly every environment humans have tried to optimize, a farm field, a livestock operation, a fishery, eventually runs into the same basic tension. The natural system doesn't divide itself into neat, manageable categories the way a spreadsheet does. A fishing net can't distinguish between a fish that's in quota and one that isn't. A field of crops can't tell the difference between the insect that's a pest and the one that's harmless. Every rule humans invent to manage a wild, interconnected system has to draw an artificial line through something that was never divided to begin with, and life on the wrong side of that line pays the price, regardless of the line's good intentions. Bycatch, in that sense, isn't really a story about fishermen being wasteful or regulators being foolish. It's a story about the gap between how nature actually operates as a tangled, indivisible web of species that all show up in the same net together, and how human institutions are forced to manage it, one narrow legal category at a time. The ocean doesn't recognize quotas. It doesn't sort itself by market value, or by which species happens to have a strict catch limit this season. Humans do that sorting after the fact, on the deck of a boat, and the sea eventually gets back whatever doesn't survive the process. It's a quiet, almost bureaucratic kind of waste, not born of greed or ignorance, but of the simple, uncomfortable fact that managing nature at an industrial scale always requires cutting it into pieces that nature itself never agreed to.